So Kishore, we are immensely proud to have you with us today. Thank you so much for your time. You're in greater demand than ever because of your latest book, Has China Won, which I hope everybody will have read or will read soon. It came out 2 weeks ago, and it has already benefited from glowing reviews in the Financial Times, in the Economist, in much of the media. So well done. And thank you for your time. For those who haven't had a chance to look at your bio in detail, you have a background in public policy and academia. You've been described by the, I can't remember whether it's the New York Times or the Financial Times, as the muse of the Asian century. The foreign policy appointed you as the top public intellectual of the world about 10 years ago. And for me, Kishore, you are the rock star of geopolitics. So we're delighted that you are giving us an hour of your time today. And if I may, and as is customary now with these online conversations, we'll start by asking you 3 or 4 questions, after which we'll engage in a conversation with our guests. So the 4 questions today for you are the following. Could you tell us a bit more about your book, of course? And also explain why it is not an anti-American pamphlet. It's very important to set it straight. Second, could you explain why the pandemic has amplified the rivalry between the US and China? 3, could you give us a sense of how this will affect trade and foreign direct investment, both in the US and China, and with, of course, spillovers to the rest of the world, particularly in Europe? And 4, could you share with us some recommendations on how to improve the relationship between the US and China? We'll start with this, Kishore, for about 15-20 minutes, and then we'll open it up to the Q&A. Thank you. Before you start, my colleague Carolina is going to remind us very briefly what are the rules of engagement for our online conversations. Carolina.
Thank you, Thierry, and good afternoon to you all. Good evening, Kishore. Thank you so much for your time, and we're looking forward to this conversation with you. To all the participants, thank you for being here. You will have noticed that you're all on mute, and we'd ask you to keep it that way during the presentation. If you have any questions or remarks, feedback, don't hesitate to use the chat box, which you can find at the bottom of your screen. Through which you can choose to send messages. Any questions can be directed to Thierry directly. You can do so by clicking on which is set automatically to everyone. If you click on the arrow, you will find Thierry in there, and you can send him the questions in private so that he can all compile them and treat them first come, first serve after the presentation. So thank you so much for being here with us, and Kishore, the floor is yours.
Thank you, both of you. And Thierry, the introduction was far too generous, but I'm grateful to you, and I'm very happy to be with all of you and from all over the places around the world. And I'm glad that you began, Thierry, by saying, can you explain to us why this book is not an anti-American book? Because I'm actually very puzzled that has become the what you call a quick description of the book, because in many ways one of my key goals of the book is to actually wake up my American friends and tell them that they're literally, not metaphorically, literally blundering into a major geopolitical contest against China without thinking through or working out a comprehensive long-term strategy. In fact, if you open up my book, and of course you can see the cover is behind me, you'll find that in the very first part, I described how I had a one-on-one lunch with Henry Kissinger in his private club, in a private room in New York in March 2018, about 2 years ago. And at the end of the lunch, I thought about what he said to me, and I sent him an email. I said, do you mind if I say in my book that at the end of my lunch, the message I got from Henry Kissinger is that the United States has launched a geopolitical contest without actually working out a comprehensive long-term strategy. And he agreed, he says, yes, go ahead. And in fact, if you actually also, as I say in my book, if you study how the United States went into the Cold War against the Soviet Union, 1949, right? 70 years ago, the United States was advised by people like George Kennan, who gave US very wise advice, which I actually repeat in the book also. He said, if you're going to take on this major geopolitical contest, you must abide by some things. Number one, he said, focus on your domestic spiritual vitality. Your society must be vibrant and strong. That's how you're going to win this geopolitical contest. Number two, cultivate friends and allies. And number three, he also said, don't insult the Soviet Union. We have to work with them. And if you insult them, you won't be able to work with them. And number four, he said, be humble. And what's interesting is that if you look at how the United States has behaved towards China since it's launched this major geopolitical contest, it's ignored all four pieces of advice that George Kennan gave 70 years ago. And so that's why I think I'm actually trying to be helpful to the United States by pointing out, think twice about what you are doing. And of course, as you know, there's a very famous piece of advice given by the Chinese strategic thinker Sun Tzu. He said, know thyself, know thine enemy, fight 1,000 battles, win 1,000 battles. And what's interesting, if you watch what the United States has done vis-a-vis China, when it comes to knowing thyself, the United States knows its strengths very well. And I do emphasize in the book, actually I write a fictional memo from a fellow Politburo member to President Xi Jinping saying, a great struggle has broken out with the United States of America. Whatever we do, let's not underestimate the United States of America. It's a very powerful, strong country. We all know that. But you must, when you go into a battle, you mustn't just know your strengths, but you must also know what your weaknesses are. And I suspect some of the criticisms of my book, which say that I'm anti-American, come from the fact that I dissect American weaknesses as clearly and harshly to remind them these are issues you have to pay attention to. And I'll give some examples. And then when it comes to knowing thine enemy, the United States knows all the weaknesses of China, but it doesn't understand the strengths of China. And if you want to take on a geopolitical contest, you shouldn't just know the weaknesses of your opponent, you also got to understand his strengths. So I'll give examples of that. And then after that, I'll answer the other questions you pose. And let me start by talking about the weaknesses of America. And clearly, George Kennan emphasized at the end of the day, whether or not America wins the geopolitical contest with the Soviet Union will depend on how strong and vibrant it is domestically. And as we know, the American economy exploded in the 1950s and 60s. The American middle class living standards went up dramatically. And America had clearly the most vibrant society in the world. But today, what even most well-informed Americans are not aware of is that America is the only major developed society where the average income of the bottom 50% has gone down over a 30-year period. And of course, when that happens, it leads to tremendous dysfunctionalities in society. It has created what two Princeton economists have said is a sea of despair among the white working classes in America. And we know what the sea of despair led to
because it led to the election of Donald Trump in 2016. They were so angry. People were not listening to them, not taking care of them. And what's amazing, while American living standards were going down, America was burning trillions of dollars fighting unnecessary wars. The Iraq War was illegal, unnecessary, complete failure, cost $3 to $5 trillion. You know, if America had just taken the $3 to $5 trillion and gave it to the bottom 50% of its population, they would have got checks about $20,000 each. And by contrast, you know, one other statistic I give in the book that is shocking is that 2/3 of American families don't have $500 in emergency cash. So if George Kennan were alive today, the first thing he would say to his fellow Americans is, we got to take care of our own society, strengthen it before we launch into a major geopolitical contest. Which is why it genuinely puzzles me that there are no other voices saying, stop and think twice before we rush headlong into this geopolitical contest against China. And then, let me turn now to the strengths of China. And of course, we all know the weaknesses. The weaknesses of China are spoken about every day in the Anglo-Saxon media. And because I don't speak about the weaknesses as much, although I point out that China has made serious mistakes in the way it's alienated the American business community, and that's why no one in the business community is supporting China anymore. China has made mistakes. But since no one in America talks about the strengths of China, I talk about the strengths. And here, just to give you a simple example, many Americans have said so openly. I mean, Kurt Campbell wrote an essay in the magazine Foreign Affairs saying that the entire American establishment believe, and by the way, General McMaster just repeated this in the Atlantic too, that as America engaged China, China would become more prosperous, China would liberalize economically, and then China would liberalize politically and become like America. And every American thought this is, of course, a natural thing to expect. And so when China didn't do that, they felt so disappointed, they felt betrayed and so angry. I can tell you, when a future historian looks at this, he or she will scratch their head and say, how is it a country like the United States that is less than 250 years old, with a population 1/4 the size of China, and this young country with 1/4 the population decided it knows better what is good for China, that China should become a democracy overnight. But the Chinese have 4,000 years of political tradition, political history, and they know that whenever the center is weak, the people suffer. Indeed, not just suffer. In the 19th century, the West trampled all over China when the center was weak. But they know that when the center is strong, the people benefit. And one simple fact that surprisingly no American seems to be aware of is that the last 40 years, the improvement in the standard of living of the Chinese people over the last 40 years has been the best they have enjoyed in 4,000 years. So after China has had its best 40 years ever, the Americans knock on the door and say, it's time to change your government, time to change your political system, be like us. And the Chinese say, why? And if you look at it, the Americans have the assumption, and this is one reason why they plunge into this geopolitical contest with China. They believe that in a contest between a democracy and a communist party system, a dynamic democracy will always defeat a communist party system. But what my book does is tend to dig deeper into the structural dimensions of both societies And you find that American democracy has effectively become a plutocracy, where all the major public decisions are made in favor of a tiny elite, which also explains why you've had a deterioration in the living standards of the bottom 50%. And by the way, Martin Wolf agrees with me that America has become a plutocracy. And by contrast, a communist party system of China, which is supposed to be rigid and sclerotic, has become the world's largest meritocracy. And the best people in China want to join the Communist Party. When I was in Columbia University assigned a very bright young graduate student from China to be my research assistant. And she told me her life story, and she said she was very sad when she graduated number 2 in her school after high school. So I said, why were you sad when you graduated number 2? She said, because only number 1 joins the Communist Party. And she missed it. Now, when you can attract the best young people to come into your Communist Party, are you telling me that this is a sclerotic Soviet-style Communist Party? It's obviously a very different animal. It has got flaws, it's got weaknesses, but it's also got strengths that are underestimated. So I'm explaining these dimensions because I'm very puzzled that this is a very complex story of strengths and weaknesses of the US and China gets translated in the American media as a complete black and white story. And what makes it this black and white story even more amazing is that 9 in 10 Americans now believe that China is a threat to America. But no one actually explains, how is China a threat to America? I mean, are the Chinese building up 10,000 tanks to ship and conquer the United States? Obviously no. They have no such plans. They know it's a mission impossible. It's not a military threat. And in terms, if there's a nuclear war, US has 6,000 nuclear weapons, China has 300, but China is seen as a threat to the United States. So there's a certain absence of facts in all this analysis. So that I'm just giving you a sense of how there's been fundamental misunderstanding on both sides. I was actually hoping, Thierry, that when the pandemic broke out, the logical and sensible thing for both countries to have done should have been to say, hey, COVID-19 is our common enemy. Let's put a strategic pause on our geopolitical contest and fight this common enemy first, which is what you do in battles. And that's why Churchill went to see Stalin to fight Hitler, because the enemy of your enemy is your friend. And frankly, the COVID-19 is an enemy of the United States, is an enemy of China. They should be working together. But the fact that they cannot work together, despite the fact that they face a phenomenal common challenge, drives home my key point that the United States has blundered into this geopolitical contest without thinking through the consequences. Now, you also asked me some other questions. How will this affect global trade and foreign direct investment in both the US and China and all that? I would say that it's far too early to tell, because I emphasize that the battle against COVID-19 is not over. We are still in the thick of it, by the way. Most of the world, most countries in the world are still in a state of lockdown. Singapore is in its 3rd week of lockdown. So we cannot tell what its long-term consequences to be. So those who predict deglobalization, decoupling, I think all those big judgments, it's a bit premature, because I don't think you can reverse globalization at all, because the one thing that we have done is open the minds of 7.5 billion people who, as you know, almost all of them now has a phone. Almost all of them know there's Taj Mahal, there's Machu Picchu, there's New York City, there's Hollywood. They want to go to all these places. You cannot deglobalize the world anymore. So I believe that the world will go back to what it was in the past. But of course, if the US-China geopolitical contest gets worse, then on the technology areas, take Huawei for an example, right? countries will have great difficulty making decisions on Huawei, because they may provide the cheapest, best 5G technology, but then the United States will come and slap you on the wrist, and you've got to make painful decisions. So those are the areas where you might see difficulties, and we can discuss some of them in the Q&A. Now, your final point is, what can we do to improve the relations between US and China? And that's actually the concluding chapter of my book, where I use the Chinese concept of yin and yang to say that opposites can live with each other. And I basically say there are 5 non-contradictions between fundamental American interests and fundamental Chinese interests. So let me give you just 2 examples. First, going back to my key point about how the average income of the bottom 50% has gone down over 30-year periods. If the American priority is to lift up the living standards of its bottom 50% and create the kind of dynamic, vibrant society that George Kennan spoke about, and if America wants to improve the well-being of its people, and China wants to improve the well-being of its people, they should be working together, not against each other. They can strengthen each other's economic growth. Frankly, as you know, if you take a train from Boston to New York to Washington, D.C., you're on a third world train, as you know, even though it's called Acela, the fast train. The infrastructure in the United States has fallen behind in so many critical areas. Why not work with China? I know it's considered inconceivable, but these are the sort of things that can happen if you look rationally about what your core interests are. And similarly, it's also very clear that the next wave of challenges the world is going to face, because the world has shrunk. Basically, in the past, when you live in 193 separate countries, it was as though you were living in 193 separate boats. But as I said in one of my previous books, The Great Convergence, that today the 7.5 billion people on the planet Earth no longer live in 193 separate boats. They live in 193 separate cabins on the same boat. But the problem is that you have captains and crews taking care of each cabin, and nobody taking care of the global boat as a whole. And if you don't take care of the boat as a whole, you just take care of your cabin, that's how COVID-19 comes out. And the viruses don't have passports. The viruses don't stop at borders. They bounce around the world within a matter of weeks. So it shows that we have to come together to take care of our global board. And this is a core common interest that US and China have. So if they focus on their common interests and their common challenges, then it's conceivable that we may actually help to prevent a major and unnecessary geopolitical contest between US and China. And that's the big goal of my book. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for exposing with such clarity the principles that underlie the reasoning of your book. So just to make sure that we understand properly the key argument that you make, it's not inevitable that the rivalry between the US and China will degrade over the next few months and years, correct? You don't
I have a paradoxical argument in my book. I say the US-China geopolitical contest is both inevitable and avoidable. It's inevitable because great powers have a certain logic, which is that whenever another great power is emerging and becoming almost as strong, the impulse of the number one power is to push down the number two power. So that geopolitical logic is still at play. And so that's why this contest is carrying on. But I'm saying in the game.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm just reading the questions as they come. There are many, of course, so I'm going to do my best in terms of aggregation. I will ask Olivier Fleureau maybe to intervene, because there are many questions around this Thucydides trap, the fact that there is a rising power threatening the position of the incumbent. So Olivier, like many other participants, has a question on that. Olivier, would you like to intervene? Olivier Fleureau.
Thank you, Thierry, and thank you very much, Kishore, for your insights. Well, it's just that I've worked a long time ago in the US, and I've always and I've worked a lot with American teams, and there is something that is so entrenched in their cultural life. They've been raised and educated as we are number one, and they're very proud of it. And as you know, Trump used that a lot for his campaign. Which advice would you give to someone who's been educated like that and raised like that? We are number one, and is seeing someone threatening that position. I think a lot of the cultural background makes it very difficult for Americans to accept that they could lose their leadership.
Well, I can see that you know the United States very well, because you're absolutely right. It seems to be an essential part of the American identity that they have to be number one. I discovered this about 6-7 years ago when, for me, longer, I was in Davos chairing a panel. We had 2 American senators, Corker and Chambliss, one New York Congresswoman, Nita Lowey, and Mike Froman, who was then Deputy National Security Advisor. So this was the panel was about the future of American power. So I said, so I asked the first obvious question, what's the future of American power? And they said, oh, we'll be number one, we'll be number one, we'll be number one, we'll be number one. I said, okay. I said, I've seen some data. And the data shows that if China maintains a certain growth rate and you maintain a certain growth rate, within about 10, 15 years, it's conceivable that China's GNP could become bigger than America's. So what would you do? And their answers shocked me. They said, oh, we'll be number one, we'll be number one, we'll be number one. And I was scratching my head. And then finally, Senator Corker was very honest. He said, Mr. Chairman, I can do the maths. I can see where you're taking us. I'm not going there. Because it's political suicide for many American politicians to speak publicly about becoming number two. And by the way, in my book, Great Convergence, I begin by quoting from a speech that Bill Clinton gave after he stepped down as president, where he said, if America is going to be number one forever, then we can keep on doing whatever we are doing. But if we can conceive of becoming number two, so surely we should be strengthening multilateral rules and processes. And he wanted to give the speech when he was president, but all his advisors said it's suicide for any American president to talk about being number two. So the great puzzle, and I haven't solved this puzzle yet, in America is a land of free speech. You can say anything you want. Anything, really. It has got the freest speech of any country in the world. But if any politician dares to stand up and say, hey, let's get ready for being number two, he's toast. And this is something that at some point in time, America has got to face squarely, because it's in America's national interest to talk about it. Because I also believe that America we can have a world where America is the number two economic power, but still the number one most attractive country in the world. There's no contradiction in the second most powerful country being the most attractive country in the world. You can still be the most attractive country in the world. You can still be number one in that area.
Thank you, Kishore.
Thank you.
There are several questions pertaining to history from participants who said that you mentioned George Kennan and his declaration about the Soviet Union of many decades ago. But is it still relevant when there is such a complete vacuum in terms of global governance and leadership?
Is it still relevant? If there's what?
Mentioning today there is a complete lack of governance, global governance, a vacuum in terms of global governance and leadership. So the era of George Kennan is long gone, argue several participants of the call. So how does that inform the position of today in terms of figuring out the rivalry between the US and China?
Yeah. Well, we face a paradoxical situation on issues of global governance, because as you know, when the World War II ended and when the Cold War began, the United States of America actively believed that the creation of strong global multilateral institutions would be good for the world, would generate peace, and would be good for American interests, and so on and so forth. So there was a strategic alignment between the perception of American interests and multilateral institutions. And America was pushing for them. And as you know, the Soviet Union was rejecting many of these institutions, wouldn't join the IMF, wouldn't join the World Bank, and so on and so forth. So today we are in a very strange situation where the United States of America is actually walking away from many of the global multilateral institutions that it created. I mean, Black World Trade Organization, certainly now it has just walked away from the World Health Organization, even though it's unwise to do so. And by contrast, China is walking towards these global multilateral institutions. And China doesn't seem to care that they were created by the West. It's happy that they're created by the West, as long as they help to create global order, which is good for China. And today, China, I forget the names, there are four UN organizations are now run by Chinese nationals. You never saw that 20, 30 years ago. So China, so the very puzzling thing about our world today is that the United States is retreating from multilateralism in a very powerful way, and China is advancing towards it. And that's a strange paradox, because it should be the opposite.
Thank you, Kishore. Let's stay for 2 seconds in the realm of history. And there is a question from Sach Chandaria. Sach, I think it'd be great if you ask the question yourself, because it has to do with Chinese nationalism and one point that Kishore made earlier. Sach?
Yeah, thank you, Terry, and hi, Kishore. Kishore, there was a while back at the JFK Kennedy School, you had given a speech and you talked about how, in your view, the Communist Party's presence in China had been positive because it had tempered nationalism, right? And I would probably, up until Xi Jinping, I would have agreed with you, right? They had always played the humble card, but Xi Jinping is unleashing nationalism in an unprecedented way. And once you open up that bottle, there is no putting the genie back. Do you still think that the Communist Party is containing nationalism?
Well, earlier somebody mentioned the Thucydides trap, and as you know, that's highlighted in Graham Allison's book, Destined for War. And Graham Allison begins the book by saying that the Americans keep saying, why can't the Chinese be like us? And Graham Allison says, be careful what you wish for. Because China today, in terms of its emergence as a great power, is exactly where America was at the end of the 19th century, when, as you know, Teddy Roosevelt emerged. And when America emerged as a great power, it started a war against Spain, conquered territories, colonized Philippines. And Graham Allison said that's normal behavior for a rising power. They use their muscle, they grab territories, they fight wars, and they defeat weaker powers. Now, what's remarkable about China's track record is that it has difficult relations with virtually all its neighbors, with India, with Japan, with South Korea, with Vietnam. And what's amazing, that despite the fact that China is emerging as a great power, become much stronger, and despite the fact that China has difficult relations with its neighbors with whom it has fought for a while, China hasn't fought a major war in 40 years of the P5 members. And China actually hasn't fired a bullet across its borders in 30 years since a naval skirmish against Vietnam. So that shows a tremendous amount of strategic discipline and restraint. And I bet you I do make that point in my book, if tomorrow China became a democracy and they had elections in China, they would vote for a far more nationalist leader than Xi Jinping, Xi Jinping would be accused of being weak. He said, why don't you just take back Taiwan now? It belongs to us. The Japanese stole it from us in 1895. Let's take it back now. We are strong. That's how the democratically elected Chinese leader would behave. So I agree with Graham Allison when he tells his fellow Americans, be careful what you wish for.
Thank you, Kishore. Fascinating. We have several questions pertaining to technology. Christine Batruch, maybe you'd like to intervene because you were the first to ask about China not being an enemy, but being a tech power confronting the US. Christine, are you on the call still? Christine? Okay. Well,
yeah, except I guess it's a mistake. I was talking about economic, but let me then raise that.
Well, there are many questions at the intersection of economics and technology.
Yeah, but it's the question of economic interdependence. I recall probably 10 years ago attending a session where, the notion of the American debt that China holds and the power that China has. So I'm wondering how this is playing out in this geopolitical battle, to what extent China has actually more tools in its hands, and it will not militarily. I was reacting to the military comment. I don't think militarily it would venture anywhere beyond the South China Sea, but economically, can it not hurt the US more than the US can hurt it?
Well, I must say that's a very good question you're asking. And I did a lot of, I had a lot of conversations about the impact of this geopolitical contest on the role of the US dollar as a global reserve currency. And, this whole debate has gone through so many phases, In phase one, the Chinese thought that if they were reliant on the American market for Americans to buy Chinese products, they wanted America to be dependent on China to buy the US Treasury bills. And by the way, it is a fact that at the height of the financial crisis, the US Treasury initially sent people to Beijing and said, please don't stop buying US Treasury bills in this crisis, because it would make the crisis even worse. So the Chinese felt, to be honest with you, became a bit arrogant and said, oh, we got a hold on the Americans. And then the Americans launched QE2. They produced US dollars out of nowhere. So Chinese lost their hold. And that changed the balance of power again. And now the most dangerous thing, and this is what I discuss in my book, this is why I say this is not an anti-American book. The most dangerous thing the United States is doing now is that it's on the one hand enjoying the exorbitant privilege of having the global reserve currency, which, as Giscard d'Estaing said, they can print money and buy goods. That's an exorbitant privilege. But they also want to use this global reserve currency as a weapon, as a geopolitical weapon. Now this, as you know, especially against Iran, so this has led to even UK, France, and Germany setting up Instex to trade with Iran. Now that's a very wise move, unwise move by the United States, because if you are enjoying the exorbitant privilege, don't create incentives for people to give up that exorbitant privilege. So I make a very, in some ways, maybe brave, foolhardy prediction that I'm pretty sure the Chinese are working out ways and means of ensuring that they don't become a prisoner of the US dollar. And how they do it, digital currencies, blockchain technology, I think it's possible at some point in time. And if the United States is not careful, it could lose, the US dollar could lose its attraction for the rest of the world, and that will take away one of the most powerful weapons the US has, because the global reserve currency is a far more powerful weapon than the 13 aircraft carrier fleets that the US has.
Thank you, Kishore. We have on the call several private investors who are active in China, who collaborate with Chinese companies and who do invest in China. So I'll ask François Pagès, who is French but based in New York, to be the porte-voix, if I may say so. And François, you have several questions and remarks in one. So we are listening to you.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. So, Dr. Mahbubani, thank you very much for your clear presentation. Indeed, I'm going to China on a regular basis, and I have personal investments over there. And I've been doing the trip over the past now 40 years. Over the past 10 years, I did notice some unfortunate evolution. The first one is I have perceived a growing sense of pride, which is great, but also an increased sense of nationalism in China. So it means one of the questioner was mentioning that the US were proud to be #1, but now a lot of the Chinese, they consider themselves the #1. The second point is what I've seen also is that while 15 years ago, 10 years ago, the Chinese, the individuals, they were proud to see their country growing and expanding in the world and their own positions to be improving. But now they are more and more saying that it is the central power, so it means the Communist Party, which is protecting its own power to the detriment of what they call themselves the shitism. So it means the people who are not part of the elite. Then the third element I did notice is that over the past 10 years, all the private companies, the private sector, step by step, they are squeezed by the SOEs, and you have this anger which is growing among the small and medium-sized and the big entrepreneurs in front of the fact that the central power in China is not defending anymore their interest. And the last point is that, as mentioned by one of the previous questioner, is that there is a feeling that the Chinese leadership over the past 10 years, because of their pride in the way they have been being the savior of the world in 2008, 9, and 10, is that now the Chinese leadership is getting more aggressive in South China Sea, more aggressive in the treatment of minorities, for example, in the Uyghur minorities, but also more aggressive in trying to stiffen any wish of expression by the individuals, and you can see the various steps they have taken in Hong Kong few days ago. So what is your perception about this evolution in China over the past few years?
Yeah, well, I suspect you may know China better in those areas than I do, but I'll give you my perceptions too. And I actually devote, on your first point about how they've become progressively more, in some ways, confident and arrogant, I devote a whole chapter in my book to one of the biggest strategic mistakes that China has made, which has been to alienate the American business community, and also, frankly, also alienate other European business communities too, with the arrogance that they have shown towards them, because they say, now you need our market, we can dictate the terms, and so on and so forth. So I think that clearly is an area where they have made a mistake. And as you know, there's some degree of reversal taking place now, where they're trying to open up their markets for more foreign investment, insurance, banks, and so on and so forth. So they realized they have made somewhat of a mistake there. On the question of the private sector and the SOEs, I must say what we have to do is to some extent look at the data. and I'm not sure what, frankly, I haven't seen the data very clearly. But the Chinese realized at one stage, the assumption was that the only way that China can grow is to expand the private sector as much and shrink the state-owned enterprises. But they've actually found that many of their state-owned enterprises have become very, very useful instruments of foreign policy. So when they go around building infrastructure, ports, roads, bridges, railways, they rely a lot on their state-owned enterprises. But of course, if the state-owned enterprises become effectively parasites, that they require state help to survive, or if they suck away state funds, then of course they're going to undermine China, and China will not succeed in that dimension. But your last point about China becoming more assertive and aggressive in South China Sea and Uyghurs and so on and so forth, and you're right, some things are happening there. But China actually was far more assertive on the South China Sea 10 years ago. 10 years ago, if you had opened up the New York Times and Financial Times, you would have found daily stories about the New York Times, about the South China Sea. Now, for several years, nothing happened. Now, my understanding, and believe me, no one really knows what happens inside China. But one of the theses in my book is that the reason why Xi Jinping took over so much power, and you're right, he's accumulated a lot of power, is that before him, his predecessor was not strong. And because his predecessor was not strong, two big dangers appeared that could have threatened the Communist Party. One was factionalism. And as you know, both Xi Lai and Zhou Yongkang tried to take over the party, hijack the party. And then the other was corruption. So Xi Jinping knew that if he didn't kill factionalism, if he didn't kill corruption, the Communist Party would die. And that's why he seized as much power as he did. And so that is one of the key driving forces. But when it comes to dealing with the rest of the world, actually, under Xi Jinping, there has been a greater effort to listen and to improve relations with other countries. So let me give an example. When were relations really bad with Japan? 2012, 2013, 2014. And you notice that since Xi Jinping came over, relations with Japan have improved. So I think he understands that he has to place some controls on the assertiveness of China, but at the same time, he cannot do too much. Because if Chinese pride, you're right, Chinese pride is rising, and if he doesn't appear to be strong, he'll be removed. So it's a very delicate game he has to play, where he has to respond to the domestic pressure to be assertive, and yet ensure that he also keeps China's relations with everybody else in line. And I can tell you, I would not envy his job. I think he has one of the most difficult jobs in the world.
Thank you, Kishore. We have 10 minutes to go. We have loads of questions, which I'm going to try to aggregate in two groups. One pertains to the point that you made about the retreat of the US from multilateralism. And the question is China ready to become the benign, quote unquote, hegemon that the world needs in order to function in terms of globalization, ensuring the safety of safe, sea lines, etc.? Could China be the benign hegemon?
Well, I'm a very old-fashioned, realistic geopolitical analyst, and I believe that the term benign hegemon is an oxymoron. Any hegemon is hegemonic and will always put its interests first. And the United States, when it was supporting multilateral institutions, did so because it saw an alignment between long-term American national interests and pushing for multilateral organization. And because there was an alignment, America supported them. But over time, America found that multilateral institutions were also constraints on American power. I'll give you a concrete example. Why did the United States withdraw from the World Court, the International Court of Justice?
because the International Court of Justice said, what you're doing to Nicaragua is wrong. So they said, okay, to hell with the International Court of Justice, right? And I think, by the way, that's a mistake on the part of the United States to walk away from these multilateral institutions. So what you're seeing today is not that China is becoming benign. There are no benign superpowers in the world. China is seeing an alignment within its national interests and this multilateral organization. So the classic example is World Trade Organization. China is now the world's #1 trading power. It wants predictability and certainty in the global trading environment. The World Trade Organization can provide it. So China says, okay, let's support the World Trade Organization. So it is not a country's being benign or not benign. It's their understanding of whether or not their core national interests are in line with global multilateralism.
Thank you, Kishore. Then many questions pertaining to tech. And I would like Barbara Mennett and Ali Bourhani to ask them, Barbara about blockchain in particular, and Ali more generally about power of China in the tech domain. Barbara? Hello.
Yes.
Good evening.
Sorry. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can, of course.
Okay, very good. I'm not sure. Yes, for the blockchain, I was just making a comment. I didn't know you were going to pick it up, but a few days ago, China launched something called the Blockchain Services Network, which is a new infrastructure for the whole of China, to connect the whole of China. All the cities, all the activities, they're starting with 100 cities, and it will cover the whole of China. And then in 2 months' time, the portal will be launched globally. And I think these are very significant developments that maybe have not been well understood, how transformational this could be for China's emergence as a, even further into the digital economy, because these also set the background for the new digital currency, which has already been developed by China's central bank. So I just thought I would just mention this, and I don't know if Kishore has any view on it.
Should I respond?
Of course, please, Kishore, yes.
I suspect that Barbara knows more about this field than I do, but I'm not surprised to hear China roll this out, because I think the one key point I emphasize in my book is that, the United States leaders are focused on the next election cycle, on the next news cycle, what's happening next 24 hours. And so the United States is very much bogged down in today. But I think that the key point that Kissinger emphasized to me at the lunch is that the Chinese are thinking 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, 20 years down the road. And they clearly see the power of blockchain technology. They can see how it will transform everything. And if China can lay the grid and infrastructure for it, that other countries can tap on, you can well imagine it gives China a tremendous competitive advantage. So this is why the United States should be very careful in the way it treats China, because China, frankly, is not going to be so easy to be pushed over at the end of the day as the Soviet Union was in the previous context.
Thank you, Kishore. Ali, 3 minutes to go, so please be brief in your question.
For sure. Kishore, thank you very much. Just a quick one. China has caught up very quickly on AI, on fintech, on anything with infrastructure. Isn't the bigger concern of the United States is that China can move very fast with the same pace on developing its place in shaping PR and public relations and global agenda, number one. And that's the biggest fear. And second, what are your takes on the Belt Road Initiative in a most stressed way after a global crisis of this size, isn't this, as a matter of fact, going to accelerate China's Belt Road Initiative, contrary to what a lot of people think, that it will take away the muster from China?
Well, two very quick answers. You're right, China is investing a lot in AI and working in that area. But I think when it comes to public relations and public image, I would say that China is frankly doing a very bad job. The Chinese haven't learned yet how to live in a media world that functions with rules and norms and a Western zeitgeist. It's a different game. And that's why the Chinese have a very hard time explaining what they're trying to do. And that's why some of the most basic things I say about China, which are true, many people in the West haven't heard about, because it hasn't been explained to them. And your second point about the Belt and Road Initiative, I completely agree with you that when countries are trying to rebuild themselves after COVID-19, they will take whatever comes to them. So the Chinese come to you and say, I'll build you a power station, I'll build you a railway line that will create jobs, grow your GNP and allow you to export. More and more countries are going to embrace the Belt and Road Initiative, because that's one thing that, if you read the Anglo-Saxon media, they only describe what they call the debt trap diplomacy of China. But there's a peer-reviewed article, if you want, Thierry, I'll send it to you, by an American academic, pointing out that all these stories of debt trap diplomacy are false. This is an academic peer-reviewed article. And that's why if the Chinese have no shortage of countries who want to join the Belt and Road Initiative, and it will grow stronger and stronger.
$10 p.m. for you in Singapore. It's late. We are most grateful for your time. As always, you've been wonderfully insightful and clear. And most of us in this conversation are Westerners. So you've given us a lot of food for thought and probably forced some of us to question some of our assumptions. We'll read your book for those of us who haven't read it yet. It just came out, and we very much.
I hope you'll get a French edition too.
We hope so. We hope so, and I hope that we will get a chance to welcome you to Chamonix. We don't know when, but for a summit of mind, so that we can continue the conversation in person. That would be wonderful. Kishore, thank you so very much from all of us, and we hope to meet you again soon.
Thank you.
Bye-bye, Kishore. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.